All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue where we left off with our material. One of the last things that we mentioned was the stomach, and as far as the cells in the stomach that help secrete a lot of the things that we need to be aware of, especially in regards to pepsin and hydrochloric acid. If we remember, pepsin is going to be more oriented with breaking down proteins and denaturing proteins, whereas hydrochloric acid just helps to break down everything. It is a very strong acid. All right, now we're moving our way down. So things were pretty easy so far, in my opinion. We started in the mouth. You make your way from the mouth into the pharynx, into the esophagus, which is just one long tube. Inevitably, we reach this curved C-shaped structure, the stomach, which, as we mentioned in our last video, is just going to help break things down, temporary storage more than anything else. But now we've really started to hit a bit of a snag. Now things get a little bit tricky. After the stomach, as you see here, it starts to coil up. We actually start to curve its way in until eventually we form this very long maze found right in the center of your chest, going to be little bit below the stomach, but this is traditionally what we call your guts, as we call it, the small intestine. So the small intestine, its main jobs, digestion. So it does have some methods of digestion that you see here, mechanical and chemical, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then the biggest job of the small intestine is without a doubt absorption. You want to be able to absorb as many nutrients as possible while you're here. So as far as in the digestion side of things, it is slightly mechanical. It's not nearly as mechanical as the stomach, or definitely not nearly as mechanical as the mouth, but it is slightly mechanical. Remember how I mentioned how you have those smooth muscles that help with peristalsis? Well, you still have smooth muscle around the small intestine. So it does help move any particles along the way. And that method of movement helps to break down particles here and there. Not substantial enough, but again, it is a mechanical process. Without a doubt, the best method of digestion that the small intestine helps with, especially in this beginning part here, is chemical. There's a bunch of enzymes that are pumped right into the beginning of the small intestine to help not only neutralize the stomach acid, but further break down food. Now, absorption is really the key player here. Why is the small intestine this long? It's approximately 20 feet, massive length. Like I mentioned, it's like a fire hose just coiled up inside of our chest cavity region. The whole entire reason why it has to be this long is to give us time to absorb. When we eat food, the longest time of digestion and inevitably passing whatever's left over through fecal matter, the longest time is here, spent in the small intestine. It's pretty quick, all things considered, to obviously chew your food, swallow your food. It does take a little bit of time in the stomach to break food down and process it. But inevitably, when we're in the small intestine, that's when things grind to a halt, practically a halt. It really goes at a slow, methodical process. That slow, methodical process allows the small intestine to absorb as many nutrients as possible, which is good. That's what keeps us alive. That's part of our nutrition, right? Now, if you notice, the small intestine is actually broken down into three distinct regions. We have the duodenum, the first section. We have the jejunum, the second section. And then we have the ileum, the third section. The duodenum is a very small region. As you'll see in the next slide, it is very, very small, but it's incredibly important because this is the region that helps us secrete digestive juices. So those digestive juices, as we'll see in the coming slides, are necessary to break down products that our body requires. So it's essential for that level of chemical digestion. The jejunum, the second area, this is one of the longest regions of the small intestine. So this is really where you're just absorbing as much as possible. Finally, the ileum. The ileum is going to be your, let's go ahead and erase this real quick. Your ileum is going to be your third region. It's not as long as the jejunum. It is still pretty long, it's a couple feet in length. You're going to be absorbing some specific things like special vitamins, vitamin B12 to be more precise. You're also going to start to absorb some extra bile, which we'll get into that in a second, and anything remaining. Its job is to try to act like a last call scenario for specifically the small intestine. Now, here's a great picture to show us exactly where everything is. I would really pay attention to this one because this color codes everything nice and neat. Out of the 20 or so feet of small intestine you have, we can give some estimates here, right? So for instance, the duodenum or the duodenum, it's about a half, 1.5 to 2 feet. Not much. It's connected right here directly to the stomach. So that's what we'd see missing in this case. But as we mentioned, it's going to be very important because of its access to the liver, to the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Next, we have this massive coiled up section right here, the jejunum, a lot of absorption, right, as we mentioned. And then as you can tell, the ileum is pretty large too. It's a little bit more coiled inward instead of expanded like the jejunum is. But the ileum, as we mentioned, helps to reabsorb anything that might be left over until inevitably the ileum will connect to this large structure that's kind of hollowed out, in this case, the large intestine. So as far as the small intestine is concerned, the things that we need to be paying attention to is how do we absorb? So we know that this chyme product, right, the food that's been broken down into kind of like a liquidy state after the stomach has done what it needs to do, has finally entered the small intestine. Well, how do we absorb it? How do we get it to your blood? That's the biggest point of the digestive system. Well, here's what we can see. The inside of the small intestine has these folds, these villi and microvilli. Those villi, if you remember back in senses, are actually very similar in structure to what we find on the tongue, at least the way they look, especially under a microscope. Their entire purpose is to increase surface area. Surface area is necessary for absorption. So, interestingly enough, the surface area of the villi is large enough to cover an entire tennis court. That's something that we can obviously picture in our minds how large a tennis court would be. So the idea here is that if you took out the small intestine and you took out the villi alone, their size of being able to absorb things is massive. Using the tennis court analogy, imagine a tennis court, right? If you were to throw a tennis ball onto the tennis court or drop water onto the tennis court, anywhere that it landed on the court means you've absorbed it. So in this case, for food purposes, you have massive area to make sure you're not avoiding any sort of necessary nutrients that you need for your body to maintain itself. Now here we see, of course, this is the larger structure, and we see a lot of these arteries and veins that are connecting to it, and those smooth muscles that I was mentioning earlier. Here we get a closer view. The villi are like these little pods, right? Inside the villi, we have these microvilli, which are much, much smaller. Obviously, microvilli indicating they're microscopic. But those structures themselves, the microvilli, are going to directly absorb any nutrients possible. Carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, everything that you can. That is inevitably going to pass into this large vessel here that connects to the lymphs, and that helps to inevitably get it to the blood. So we can kind of start to piece together what actually is going on. So let's get a little bit more into that. The villi and the microvilli specifically absorb the nutrients found from the broken down compounds of food. So all before this process, your entire job when you're eating food was just break it down, make it smaller. You need to make it much, much smaller. These nutrients transfer via the capillaries into the bloodstream to be sent to numerous areas of the body. This is incredibly small. The microvilli that you see here are typically about 1 cell layer thick. That's very similar, if you remember back in the respiratory system, to about the distance between the alveoli and the blood. Remember how we mentioned how in order for things to move fast via our diffusion rule, you want minimum number of layers. The more layers you add, the slower it takes for something to go from high to low concentration. That rule applies here. If you have a lot of proteins, a lot of fats, a lot of carbs, whatever the case on the outside, and you don't have a lot in the capillaries, naturally, you're going to absorb it via diffusion. It's going to move fast because it's only 1 cell layer thick. And then inevitably, when it reaches the blood, we should know what happens next. Circulation. Your heart pumps, shoots the blood throughout your entire body. And as the blood goes through the different organs, it passes off, like it basically hands off any nutrients it needs, picks up any waste that it needs, and the whole circulatory process continues. All right, so this is something that we're probably going to finish with here just because it can get a little bit dense. But remember how we mentioned we have these accessory organs? These are organs that help with the process. Most of these organs don't directly touch food, excluding your teeth and tongue. These are our digestive glands. These four that we can see here, or three that we can see here, sorry. We have the pancreas, which is this horizontal organ that kind of peeks its head a little bit, that you can sort of see slightly. We have the gallbladder, and then on this picture here, you can really see it right on top of the gallbladder. We have this massive structure, the liver. So those three organs in particular play a massive job with all this. What else do you see in this picture? You can see the stomach, you can see some veins, you can see some arteries. Here we see the spleen, pretty important organ, especially for red blood cells. And then you see the kidneys down here too. So you can get a good understanding of how tight everything is in this area. So first and foremost, the job of these digestive glands, or one of these particular digestive glands, is going to be secreting bile directly into the duodenum, or the small intestine, the beginning of the small intestine, as we mentioned, via what's called the major duodenal papilla. So there's a special tube, basically, that secretes stuff right into the small intestine. And what is this stuff? Bile. We'll get into that in just a second. The pancreas, its job, apart from having a responsibility for the endocrine system, like we learned in our last unit, its job for the exocrine, or digestive system in this case, is going to be to neutralize chyme. You need to make this stuff not as acidic, because if the acidity of the stuff is still roughly pH 2 and it's starting to pass through your small intestine and were to reach your large intestine, that would be very painful. So at the beginning of the small intestine, your job here is neutralizing as much as possible. What is a major neutralizing agent? Bicarbonate. Bicarbonate does an amazing job of neutralizing your strong acids. What else do we find from the pancreas? Well, it also secretes things like protease, amylase, and lipase. Remember, the suffix ase just tells us it's an enzyme, whereas the prefix is really giving you everything you need here. Pro is protein. Lip is lipids. Amylase, I talked about that one in the mouth. Ami indicates amylose, which is a type of sugar, like glucose. So the pancreas really secretes a bunch of protein or carb breaking down or fat breaking down enzymes that just break down these macromolecules even further. Now, speaking of bile is something that is a two-part process. So there's two organs that play a major role with this. First and foremost, common misconception here, I'm going to underline this just so we're clear. The bile is made in the liver. So the liver makes the bile. It is stored, however, in this green pouch that we see here, the gallbladder. So the liver makes it, the gallbladder stores it. That is the relationship that these two organs have. Why is bile so important? First of all, some of us may be aware of bile, especially if you've unfortunately gotten sick in the past or had an upset stomach and you've had to undergo what's called emesis or vomiting. Oftentimes, if you've already been digesting whatever was in your stomach and it's making its way into the small intestine, when you force everything back out, that is going to include bile. Bile is usually this greenish yellow color, so it's kind of disgusting in look. But the entire purpose of why we have it is this last bullet here, and our last subject for today's video: emulsification. The idea here is that if you think about how we break down food, we mentioned that when you enter food in your mouth, you have saliva, right? Saliva helps to break down carbs via amylase. Okay, good. So we've knocked down carbs, or we're starting to knock down carbs. Then the food is going to enter your stomach. The stomach acid is going to be great for breaking down proteins because of things like pepsin. Okay, cool. So now we're taking carbs and proteins. But if you notice, the other major macromolecule, fat, we have not been able to properly touch yet. And it's because fat has a very complex structure with its fatty acid method and all this type of stuff that's a little bit more biochemistry than you may need. So your body recognizes that. Your body recognizes we still need this stuff, especially healthy fats, right? So you undergo what's called emulsification. This is the process in which the fat molecules that have finally entered the small intestine, you coat the fat molecules in bile. By coating the molecules in bile, it then becomes able to be destroyed and be absorbed. So it is a bit of a process where you're basically saying, all right, we're going to cover this fat molecule with a bunch of bile. Eventually, that allows it to get destroyed even further and then absorbed. And the stuff that you're absorbing, these are the products that make up fat, right? Fatty acids, glycerol, that stuff we don't need to worry too much about yet. But this whole method is necessary. Without bile, you're going to pass fat right through you, and that can be harmful to not only your digestive system, but the overall health of your body. Remember, your body still needs fat. It is something healthy for you, especially healthy fats in comparison to your unhealthy fats. But that's where we're going to finish off for today. Again, making good progress. We're on page 16 of 30, so I could probably see 3 or so more videos for this. We'll see how we're pacing. But as usual, feel free to jump into a Hangout call if you need any help or send me a remind. But we're making pretty good progress on this. So thanks, guys, for listening. Be sure to tune in for the next one.